beneath the rubble of a war that reshaped the world, lies another war entirely, one never recorded in textbooks, never carved into memorials. It was fought in silence, across sealed tunnels, sunken convoys, and frostbitten bunkers, where files vanished before they were ever read, and machines were buried before their blueprints saw daylight. In these forgotten corridors of history, shadows outweigh victories. Each secret uncovered seems only to conceal another darker truth beneath the surface. What appears as progress carries the residue of compromise. What shines as triumph is haunted by silence. These stories linger like smoke in a locked room, warning that what was hidden was never meant to be unearthed, and that sometimes the cost of knowing is heavier than the weight of not. Welcome to the archives that were never meant to be opened. Chapter 1. Shadows of Operation Paperclip. In the winter of 1945, as the ruins of Berlin smoked beneath the heavy boots of the Red Army, Allied intelligence operatives fanned out across the collapsing Reich with orders marked top secret. Among their objectives was Operation Paperclip, a program presented to the public as a pragmatic effort to secure German scientists for America's post-war industry. Yet the declassified fragments of correspondence and interrogation transcripts tell a far grimmer truth. Buried in the National Archives, box numbers faded with time, are memoranda stamped with the Black Eagle of the Reich, their margins annotated by OSS officers in rushed pencil strokes. These men were not mere engineers. They were men who had supervised forced labor at Mittelwerk, conducted chemical weapons experiments on prisoners in Dachau, and signed requisitions for human subjects. Transferred from Buchenwald, the heart of Paperclip lay not in the pristine laboratories of Peenemünde, but in the ashes of camps and the shattered basements of bombed-out factories. Reports dated March 1945 describe American teams entering Nordhausen under cover of artillery smoke. What they found was not only the V-2 rockets hidden in underground tunnels, but also racks of documents, schematic drawings, and personnel files. The tunnels themselves were littered with the dead, slave laborers who had collapsed at their workstations during the frantic final days. The official military communiqué omit these details, but testimony from Sergeant Raymond J. Curry, preserved in a handwritten statement, tells of rows of corpses, the odor of lime, and stacks of engines pulled from crates bearing the swastika. Yet within days, the surviving German engineers were escorted out under armed guard. Not as prisoners, but as valuable assets. Werner von Braun, remembered in American classrooms as the architect of Apollo, appears in these files with a different aura. Reports note his SS membership and his presence during executions at Mittelwerk. When British interrogators at CSDIC, Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Centre, attempted to press him on these matters, the transcripts end abruptly, replaced with a notation. Transferred per paperclip directive. The files were stamped, not to be released. Similar cases multiplied. Walter Schreiber, a physician tied to human experimentation at Dachau, quietly relocated to Texas. Arthur Rudolph, program director for V-2 production, implicated in mass deaths of laborers, resettled in Huntsville, Alabama. The mechanics of the operation reveal the methodical erasure of past crimes. In July 1945, a memorandum circulated within the War Department outlined the need to sanitize personnel dossiers. Attached were lists of SS affiliations, party ranks, and notations of war crimes accusations, all struck through in thick black ink. The justification was clear. If these details remained, the scientists would be barred from emigration under Allied policy. Thus, the past was deliberately edited, and men who should have stood trial at Nuremberg were instead flown to Washington on military aircraft, their records altered, their identities reframed as apolitical technicians. Meanwhile, the Soviets ran their own parallel operation, sweeping through Thuringia and Saxony to capture facilities before American units arrived. Smersh agents seized entire factories, disassembled machine tools, and loaded freight trains bound for Moscow. In the confusion, entire families of German scientists disappeared into the Soviet system, never resurfacing in the West. For the Americans, this only increased the urgency. Competition with their wartime allies justified not only the recruitment but the concealment of atrocities. Paperclip became not just a race for rockets, but a race to bury inconvenient truths. One of the most telling documents is a heavily redacted OSS cable, dated November 1945, marked Eyes Only. It describes the transfer of Category A personnel from Bavaria to the United States via Camp King and the Rhine-Main Airfield. The names listed include engineers, physicians, and chemists, all previously flagged for potential prosecution. The note ends with a chilling line: war crimes considerations to be set aside in favor of strategic necessity. In the sanitized histories written afterward, this cable vanished, replaced by narratives of scientific progress and Cold War necessity. For the families of the victims at Mittelwerk, Dachau and Buchenwald, there was no justice. Survivors testified at Nuremberg about the brutal conditions in the underground tunnels, the 12-hour shifts under constant bombing, the executions carried out as warnings. Yet few of the supervisors ever faced trial. Instead, they donned new identities, became professors, consultants, and defense contractors. In the classified files, fragments of their old lives surface like stains. A requisition order for Zyklon B testing signed by a future NASA advisor. A report on cold immersion experiments, authored by a physician later employed at Brooks Air Force Base. Each line is a reminder that the pursuit of power outweighed the pursuit of justice. By the early 1950s, Paperclip scientists were embedded deeply within American institutions. Von Braun lectured at military academies. Rudolph oversaw rocket assembly lines. Schreiber advised on biological warfare defense. Their pasts remained locked in cabinets, hidden under security classifications that would not lift for decades. When fragments of the truth surfaced in the 1980s, the Department of Justice's Office of Special Investigations attempted to revisit these cases. Yet by then, most of the men were elderly or deceased. Their contributions to the Cold War too entrenched to unravel. Public outrage was brief, and the files returned to storage. To walk through the archives today is to piece together a mosaic of omission. The typed orders with missing pages, the photographs marked restricted, the testimonies cut short mid-sentence, all point to a deliberate policy. Operation Paperclip was not simply a recruitment of talent. It was a rewriting of history, a burial of guilt beneath the triumphant narrative of American technological ascendancy. In this silence lies the echo of the camps, the tunnels, the experiments, all erased in the name of progress. At its core, Paperclip reveals the uneasy truth that victory in war does not always mean justice. The men who once saluted the Reich's banners walked free beneath new flags, their crimes redacted, their knowledge preserved. In Huntsville, Houston, and Cape Canaveral, monuments to their achievements still stand, gleaming against the sky. Yet in the archives, in the forgotten testimonies of survivors, the shadows remain. Shadows of a bargain struck in secrecy, where the cost of supremacy was silence, and the victims' voices were consigned to dust. The legacy of Paperclip is not only on the moon, but also in the hidden files, where history itself was rewritten to serve the needs of a new war. Chapter 2: The Vanished Convoy of the Baltic. On the night of April 12, 1945, as Soviet artillery pounded Königsberg into submission, a small flotilla slipped out of Gotenhafen harbour under a cloak of fog. Its designation was recorded in Kriegsmarine logs as Operation Seawolf, though the name was later erased from surviving records. Officially, the ships were said to be carrying wounded soldiers and desperate civilians fleeing the advance of the Red Army. Yet decrypted intercepts from Bletchley Park tell another story. Station X analysts noted irregular radio traffic, signals referring to Morgenröte, and high-value cargo requiring armoured guard. In one decrypted fragment, the cargo is referred to not as passengers, but as material of highest classification. The Royal Navy flagged the convoy for observation, but the chaos of the war's final weeks allowed it to vanish into the cold expanse of the Baltic Sea. The flotilla reportedly consisted of 3 freighters, Oderland, Weserberg, and Heinrich Seidel, escorted by 2 torpedo boats. Survivors later interrogated by Smersh officers spoke of unusual precautions taken before departure. Crates bearing the Reichsadler were loaded under searchlights at midnight, sealed with lead, and guarded by Waffen-SS units armed with MP40s. One survivor, a machinist named Karl Brenner, recalled seeing a manifest clipped to a clipboard that listed Archivgut, archival, material, alongside vague entries, such as Gerät A7 and Project Morgenröte. None of these terms appear in standard Kriegsmarine supply logs. Witnesses claimed SS officers warned crew members that speaking of the cargo would result in immediate execution. What little is known of the convoy's journey comes from naval dispatches intercepted. by the British Admiralty in Soviet submarine logs. At 03:15 hours on April 14th, the freighter Oderland reportedly sent a distress call while southeast of Bornholm Island. A Soviet submarine, L-3, under Captain Vladimir Konovalov, recorded torpedoing a large German transport in the same sector. Decades later, divers found wreckage matching the description, its holds twisted and burned. Curiously, compartments that should have contained refugee bunks were instead reinforced with steel plating. Scorched fragments of what appeared to be filing cabinets and burnt microfilm reels were retrieved, though their origin was never confirmed. The crates themselves, if they survived the sinking, remain buried in silt and ice. The Weserberg and Heinrich Seidel were never officially accounted for. Some Soviet sources suggest they were captured intact and redirected to Liepaja, their cargo removed under armed guard and transported by rail eastward. Others claim both ships were sunk in the confusion of U-boat and Soviet submarine engagements, their fates lost in the chaos of naval warfare. A 1946 OSS field report from Copenhagen references rumors of a German convoy transporting files and experimental apparatus westward for future continuation of projects beyond Reich borders. The report speculates that the equipment may have been bound for Norway, where remote fjords could conceal experimental weapons programs or act as staging grounds for post-war escape networks. Further evidence emerges in fragmentary testimonies collected in 1951 during Allied interrogations of former Abwehr officers. One officer, Heinz Kessler, spoke of a directive issued in February 1945 ordering the evacuation of materials vital to the continuation of research in exile. The directive referenced Morgenrötter, described as a code name for experimental power systems, though no technical details were preserved. Kessler believed the cargo included not only technical files, but also precious metals and looted archives from the Reich Main Security Office. His testimony was marked unverified and quietly filed away. The Soviets remained tight-lipped about the matter. Smersh records from 1945, partially declassified in the 1990s, reveal interrogations of captured convoy crewmen, but transcripts are heavily redacted. Notations in the margins include references to Archive Moskwa and unidentified equipment secured. The lack of follow-up. Reports suggest the material was absorbed into Soviet programs without acknowledgement. Western intelligence speculated for decades that elements of the convoy's cargo may have informed early Soviet advances in jet propulsion or nuclear research. No definitive link has ever been established, though the timing is suspicious. In West Germany during the 1960s, rumors of the vanished convoy resurfaced in connection with investigations into Odessa, the clandestine network aiding former SS officers' escape to South America. Files from the Bundesnachrichtendienst, BND, include notes on a Baltic transport operation, allegedly tied to financial transfers and the concealment of incriminating documents. One agent speculated the convoy carried evidence of war crimes, intended for destruction or relocation beyond Allied reach. If so, the success of the mission would explain the gaps in many post-war prosecutions where key files mysteriously disappeared or never surfaced. Modern explorations of the Baltic have only deepened the mystery. In 1994, a joint Swedish-Polish diving team investigating wartime wrecks located a freighter resting at 60 meters depth off Bornholm. The ship's bow bore signs of torpedo damage, consistent with Konovalov's account. Inside the wreck, divers found remnants of sealed crates, their contents reduced to twisted metal and charred paper. Radiation surveys detected faint anomalies, though inconclusive. Maritime authorities classified the wreck as hazardous and restricted further access. Official explanations cited the presence of wartime munitions. Yet conspiracy researchers insist the restrictions conceal something more dangerous. The fate of the convoy illustrates a larger pattern of erasure in the final months of the Third Reich. As defeat became inevitable, resources were redirected not toward defense, but toward concealment and relocation. Files vanished, archives were burned, and ships like those in Operation Seawolf carried away evidence of projects that never reached completion. Whether these efforts succeeded, or whether the cargo lies at the bottom of the Baltic, remains uncertain. What is clear is that the Allies never secured the full record of Nazi research, and the Soviet silence suggests discoveries too valuable or too incriminating to disclose. Today, the story of the vanished convoy lingers in fragments, half-burned manifests, redacted interrogation transcripts, sonar images of wreckage lying silent under black water. Each piece points toward a truth carefully hidden at the war's end, a truth preserved only in rumors and classified archives. The last voyage of Operation Seawolf is not remembered in schoolbooks or naval histories. It survives instead in the whispers of divers, in the missing pages of wartime files, and in the cold silence of the Baltic depths, where the answers remain entombed beyond reach. To open those steel compartments now, if they still exist, would be to reopen questions the victors chose to leave buried. Chapter 3. The Ghost Airfield of Manchuria. In the closing days of the Pacific War, amid the vast forests and steppe of occupied Manchuria, Soviet scouts stumbled upon a facility that defied every expectation. Buried in reports from the Red Army's First Far Eastern Front, dated August 1945, is mention of a secluded Japanese airstrip known only by its code name, Base Koyo. Located near the remote settlement of Mudanjiang, it had escaped Allied aerial reconnaissance, camouflaged beneath pine canopies and shielded by elaborate deception nets. The Soviets arrived only days after Tokyo's formal surrender, yet the base bore signs of frantic abandonment. Maps left on tables, hangar doors unlatched, fuel drums still warm. It was, as one Soviet colonel noted in his after-action log, a facility designed for a war not yet fought. At the center of the discovery were 4 incomplete aircraft. Hidden in hangars carved directly into the hillside, Soviet engineers identified them as prototypes for the Tachikawa Ki-74, a long-range reconnaissance bomber never known to have entered mass production. Yet these airframes had been heavily modified, fuel tanks extended into the fuselage. Nose compartments bore attachment points for engines not of Japanese origin. Scattered among the debris were crates marked in German, containing dismantled Jumo 004 jet engines, the same engines that powered the Messerschmitt Me 262. Soviet inspectors concluded these had been delivered via submarine transfer under the clandestine Yanagi missions, Axis technology exchanges carried out even in the final years of the war. What alarmed investigators most were the documents recovered in the base's operations hut. Soviet intelligence photographs reveal wall charts plotting flight paths eastward across the Pacific. One map showed arcs stretching from Manchuria over the Aleutian Islands, reaching as far as the continental United States. Pinned alongside were weather reports, annotated in Japanese and German, noting prevailing jet stream patterns. The implication was clear. Base Koyo had been preparing for a campaign of transoceanic bombing, potentially targeting American cities at a time when Japan's mainland defenses were already collapsing. The Red Army immediately cordoned off the site, but the discovery was never reported publicly. A classified Soviet memorandum, declassified only in fragments in the 1990s, details the orders issued on August 24, 1945. All material was to be confiscated, hangars demolished, and the runway obliterated by explosives. Surviving personnel were interrogated by SMERSH, with transcripts filed under Project Archive 27. Many of those transcripts remain missing. What can be pieced together suggests the Japanese engineers left behind were either executed or deported to labor camps deep in Siberia. Their names do not appear in any post-war census. American occupation authorities, stationed thousands of miles away in Tokyo, remained unaware of the installation's full scope. In September 1945, OSS agents interrogated members of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service, pressing them on rumors of long-range bomber development. Responses were evasive. General Masakazu Kawabe admitted to experimental projects, but insisted they were dismantled by the time of surrender. When pressed about German involvement, Kawabe flatly denied any collaboration beyond the earlier U-boat missions. His testimony contradicted Soviet findings, but without direct access to Manchurian territory, American officials could not verify his claims. The Soviets, meanwhile, absorbed the spoils into their own programs. Within a year, Soviet aircraft engineers were experimenting with hybrid long-range bomber designs, many resembling the blueprints taken from Base Koyo. Elements of these designs surfaced in prototypes, such as the Tupolev Tu-85, an aircraft capable of striking targets across oceans. Whether the Japanese base influenced this development remains speculative, but the timing aligns too closely to ignore. Soviet secrecy ensured the narrative of Japanese long-range ambitions vanished from public record, relegated to whispers in classified circles. What makes the story of Base Koyo particularly disturbing is its deliberate erasure. Aerial photographs taken by US reconnaissance in the 1950s show faint scars in the forest near Mudanjiang. An unnatural clearing shaped like a runway, abruptly cut short at both ends. Local villagers interviewed decades later spoke of a strange airfield demolished by Soviet troops, of trucks loaded with equipment disappearing eastward, and of soldiers warning them never to return. Official Soviet maps published after the war omitted the site entirely. It had been swallowed whole by the forest, reduced to little more than rumors among those who lived nearby. Declassified Japanese wartime files provide only the faintest confirmation. A 1944 memorandum from the Ministry of Munitions references Project Koyo, described cryptically as a strategic countermeasure initiative requiring special allocation of imported materials. The attached requisitions list German-made parts, precision instruments, and heavy machinery uncharacteristic of Japan's isolated wartime industry. Yet the document ends abruptly, the final pages missing. Historians suspect they were deliberately destroyed in August 1945 when orders were issued to burn sensitive records ahead of the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. Survivors of the war who served in Manchuria rarely spoke of the airfield. One testimony recorded in 1963 from a Japanese mechanic named Shigeru Okada describes working in a forest installation where foreign technicians with German accents inspected engines. He recalled strict security, with soldiers threatening immediate execution for any disclosure. Okada was captured by the Soviets in 1945 and spent 8 years in a labor camp before returning to Japan. His testimony was dismissed at the time as exaggerated, but it aligns with Soviet documents describing German involvement at Base Koyo. The Cold War buried the story further. By the 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had advanced their own long-range bomber and missile programs, and the relevance of a half-finished Japanese base seemed marginal compared to nuclear deterrence. Yet within intelligence circles, the discovery served as a sobering reminder of how close the Pacific War may have come to expanding into North America. A Japanese bomber, powered by German jet engines, carrying chemical or incendiary payloads across the Pacific, would not have changed the war's outcome, but it could have devastated cities and altered public perception of the conflict forever. Today, nothing remains of Base Koyo on the surface. The forests of Heilongjiang province have reclaimed the land, erasing the scars of the runway and hangars. Yet beneath the soil, rusting fragments of fuel drums, shattered concrete foundations, and collapsed tunnels may still lie buried. Researchers who have attempted to access the site have faced restrictions from Chinese authorities, who cite safety concerns but offer no explanation. The secrecy persists, echoing the orders issued by Soviet commanders in 1945: conceal, demolish, and forget. The ghost airfield of Manchuria remains a case study in wartime ambition, secrecy, and erasure. It is a story told only in fragments: Soviet logs, missing Japanese files, whispered testimonies, and faint lines visible from the sky. Together, they form the outline of a war that almost expanded far beyond the Pacific. A war of shadows in which technology and desperation converged in the forests of Manchuria. The truth of Base Koyo was buried in 1945, but its ghost lingers, a silent reminder of how easily history can be hidden when the victors demand silence. Chapter 4: The Disappearing Files of Operation Sunrise. In the spring of 1945, Switzerland was a sanctuary of shadows. Officially neutral, the Alpine nation became the stage for one of the war's most secretive negotiations: Operation Sunrise. What the history books describe as a straightforward surrender agreement between Allied intelligence and SS General Karl Wolff is, in reality, a story buried under layers of redaction. In the archives of the Office of Strategic Services, folders once filled with telegrams and meeting notes are now marked by missing pages and unexplained gaps. What survives paints a picture not of surrender, but of bargaining in the twilight of the Reich, where loyalty, justice, and truth were traded for expediency. The meetings began in March 1945, in discreet hotel rooms in Zurich and Lucerne. Alan Dulles, then OSS station chief in Bern, coordinated with Swiss intermediaries to open lines of communication with Wolff, Himmler's chief of staff, and SS Supreme Commander in Italy. The stated aim was to arrange an orderly capitulation of German forces in northern Italy. Yet Swiss police reports, only declassified in the late 1980s, describe unusual gatherings in secluded chalets, German envoys carrying suitcases, Allied couriers escorted by plainclothes guards, and documents exchanged under candlelight. These reports note not just discussions of surrender, but also lists of names and maps of Alpine regions dotted with black crosses. The names, according to a partially legible OSS cable dated March 16, 1945, belonged to individuals within the SS and Gestapo hierarchy. Some were marked with symbols denoting priority protection. Wolf, seeking to save himself from prosecution, allegedly offered the Allies access to these men in exchange for leniency. What became of those names remains unknown. Many of the men suspected of involvement in war crimes along the Italian front disappeared in the post-war years, slipping into civilian life or vanishing abroad. Italian investigators in the 1950s lamented the absence of files that could have tied these men to massacres in Tuscany and Emilia-Romagna. Equally troubling are the references to hidden assets. A report authored by Swiss mediator Max Weibel, preserved in private papers until his death, describes Wolf's men discussing financial reserves secured in Alpine vaults. These reserves included Reichsbank gold, foreign currency, and stolen art, much of it looted from Jewish families deported to Auschwitz. Trains departing from northern Italy under SS Guard were observed heading toward remote valleys in Ticino and Graubünden. Their cargo never fully accounted for. When asked decades later, Wolf denied knowledge of such shipments. Yet Weibel's notes are clear. The fate of these reserves was negotiated in Switzerland as part of Sunrise. British intelligence too was aware of these dealings. MI6 files released in fragments reveal frustration at being sidelined by the OSS. A cable from London to Bern, dated March 28, 1945, complains that American intermediaries appear willing to make commitments beyond surrender terms, including guarantees of silence. The complaint includes references to missing enclosures, maps and lists that were removed before the files were archived. The implication is stark. Entire agreements, perhaps promises to shield certain men or conceal certain crimes, were excised before the official record was finalized. When the war ended, Operation Sunrise was celebrated publicly as a diplomatic triumph. Wolf surrendered his forces in Italy on May 2, 1945, sparing countless lives and hastening the collapse of German resistance in the region. Yet Wolf himself escaped execution at Nuremberg. Instead, he testified as a witness and was sentenced to a mere 15 years, serving just over a decade before his release in 1959. His relatively light punishment, compared to other high-ranking SS officers, fueled speculation that Sunrise had shielded him from harsher justice. Survivors of massacres at Sant'Anna di Stazzema and Marzabotto were left to wonder why the man ultimately responsible for SS units in Italy faced only a fraction of the accountability others endured. The files that could provide answers are missing. Requests for documents under the US Freedom of Information Act often return heavily redacted pages or notations that the files were destroyed. In Switzerland, Weibel's private notes mention Alpine bunkers, some sealed under deliberate avalanches, believed to contain crates of documents and valuables. Post-war searches by Allied occupation authorities in Austria and northern Italy did uncover caches of stolen art and gold, yet many shipments remain untraced. Whether these were the same assets discussed in Swiss chalets under the codename Sunrise is unclear, but the coincidences are difficult to ignore. One particularly haunting clue comes from a captured SS officer's diary, recovered in 1947 from a safe house near Munich. The diary references Sunrise deals and pacts for silence struck with American officers. The author, whose name was blacked out in subsequent releases, claimed that Wolf's surrender was only part of the bargain, that other SS officers were offered escape routes through Switzerland in exchange for logistical cooperation. The diary was entered into evidence in post-war trials but disappeared shortly thereafter. No trace of it exists today beyond the citation in court records. For decades, survivors and historians pressed for clarity, but each inquiry ran into the same wall of secrecy. In 1978, Italian parliamentary investigators examined massacres carried out by SS troops in 1944 and 1945. They discovered a hidden archive in Rome, later dubbed the Armadio della Vergogna, Cupboard of Shame, containing 695 files on war crimes committed in Italy. Many of the perpetrators named in those files had never been prosecuted. When investigators compared these names to surviving references from Operation Sunrise, overlaps were evident. Men who should have faced trial had slipped away, possibly shielded by the negotiations in Switzerland. Operation Sunrise remains a study in how victors can choose silence over transparency. What began as a military surrender evolved into a murky exchange. Freedom for some in return for strategic advantage. Justice deferred for the sake of expedience. The files that could prove the full scope of these bargains have vanished, perhaps destroyed, perhaps hidden in alpine bunkers or sealed in private collections. What remains is a trail of missing documents, unexplained leniency, and unanswered questions. The legacy of Sunrise is not one of light, but of shadows. It illustrates how, in the dying days of the war, morality was negotiated away in smoke-filled rooms where generals and spies spoke in whispers. The files that disappeared were not mere papers. They were the stories of massacred villages, stolen fortunes, and betrayed victims. Today, the silence of those archives speaks louder than the official record. The deal struck in Switzerland brought a quicker end to one front of the war, but at the price of truths buried and justice denied. That price is still being counted in the hollow gaps of history. Chapter 5. The Forgotten Bunkers of Greenland. Ice. In the frozen expanse of Greenland during World War II, Allied operations stretched far beyond the scope of conventional battlefields. While the public record describes simple weather outposts used to track Atlantic storms and guide convoys, a deeper layer of secrecy is suggested by fragments of erased documents and oral testimony. Among the scattered files lies reference to an installation codenamed Bluestone. Unlike the known stations established by Danish and American teams, Bluestone appears in only a handful of wartime cables, and even then as a ghost entry. Coordinates withheld, personnel unnamed. Purpose described vaguely as meteorological with supplemental intelligence. Yet whispers in declassified correspondence hint at something more. A buried site, hidden beneath ice caverns, where transmissions in German and English were intercepted, encrypted, and logged before disappearing into channels that no archivist can fully trace. The origins of Bluestone trace to 1942, when U-boat patrols in the North Atlantic disrupted Allied shipping and threatened the lifeline to Britain. Weather reports from Greenland were vital to predicting storms that determined convoy survival. The Germans attempted to establish their own stations on the island, several of which were discovered and dismantled by US Coast Guard patrols. In the aftermath, American intelligence pushed for a hardened installation deep inland, safe from Luftwaffe reconnaissance and naval attack. According to a requisition form discovered in the US Army Corps of Engineers archives, equipment for subsurface construction was shipped to Ivitut, the cryolite mine town that served as a logistical hub. From there, crates marked Bluestone were transported by sled convoys into the ice sheet. No official record states where they were delivered. Accounts from Greenlandic hunters collected in the 1950s speak of American soldiers building tunnels in the ice, guarded by armed patrols who warned locals away. They describe sled dogs frightened by the smell of fuel and the humming of machines underground. Such stories were dismissed as folklore until 1972, when Danish researchers stumbled upon rusted communication, equipment buried under glacial melt near Scoresby Sound. Serial numbers on the components traced not to known weather stations but to classified OSS supply orders. Within weeks of the discovery, Danish authorities sealed the area, citing environmental hazards, and the artifacts were quietly removed. What function Bluestone truly served remains uncertain, but fragments suggest it was more than a weather post. A decrypted German signal intercepted in 1943 refers to transmissions compromised from northern ice. This phrase, though vague, implies that Allied cryptographers in Greenland were not just collecting meteorological data, but actively intercepting Axis traffic. Further support comes from a US Navy memorandum dated June 1944, describing progress in polar signal analysis. The memo references Bluestone project results, but the attached appendices are missing. In place of the data are blank pages stamped "Withdrawn by authority of Army Security Agency, 1951. Such deliberate excision points to classified work in cryptography, perhaps intercepting long-range Enigma communications bouncing through the polar ionosphere. The Cold War added another layer of silence. In 1959, the United States began constructing Camp Century, a vast base dug under the Greenland ice cap. During excavation, engineers reported encountering pre-existing tunnels filled with decayed equipment, oil drums, and sealed wooden crates. Officially, these were dismissed as abandoned supply caches. Yet one engineer, in a testimony given years later, described stenciled markings on the crates, Allied symbols alongside faded German script. He recalled being ordered to reseal the tunnels immediately. The US Army's official history of Camp Century omits any reference to such findings, but the engineer's affidavit was filed with the Danish Parliament in 1997, resurfacing the question of what had been hidden beneath the ice for half a century. Archival searches in Copenhagen reveal hints of deliberate suppression. In 1946, the Danish Foreign Ministry received a memorandum from the US State Department acknowledging the presence of special operations units in Greenland. The document urged discretion, emphasizing that disclosure would complicate post-war settlement agreements. Attached to the memo was a list of 37 Danish nationals employed in Greenland between 1943 and 1945. Several names were annotated Bluestone. None of these individuals appeared in subsequent employment records. Their post-war fates untraceable. Whether they were silenced, resettled, or simply erased remains unknown. The most tantalizing evidence comes from a recovered logbook, discovered in 2001 among private papers of a deceased American officer. The log, marked Bluestone Signals, covers only 6 weeks in early 1944. Entries describe clear intercepts of Axis naval, traffic, and attempted decrypts using experimental algorithms. One page mentions testing combined British and captured German machinery, suggesting Bluestone may have been used to trial early computing devices for code breaking. Another entry, dated March 14, 1944, states, urgent, transmission not of German origin, anomalous signature, forwarded to HQ. The log ends abruptly the following day, replaced by blank sheets. Who ordered the termination and what the anomalous signature referred to has never been explained. Why Bluestone was erased from history is a question that lingers like a cold shadow. Perhaps it was simply a casualty of Cold War compartmentalization, its story buried beneath newer projects. Perhaps it concealed intelligence deals too sensitive to expose, involving captured German technology or cooperation with Danish authorities beyond public acknowledgement. Or perhaps it uncovered signals or data that raised questions the Allies preferred never to answer. Whatever the truth, its traces are scattered. A requisition form, a missing appendix, a diver's report of rusting crates under the ice, and local stories of tunnels that vanished with the melt. Today, the Arctic winds howl across the same glaciers that once concealed Bluestone. The ice has shifted, swallowing evidence into crevasses or carrying it out to sea. Yet every so often fragments re-emerge, a rusted antenna, a crate label, a misplaced memo in a declassified file. Together, they whisper of a bunker that never officially existed, a place where silence was built into the walls of ice. The forgotten bunkers of Greenland remain a chilling reminder that some secrets are not destroyed, only buried, waiting for the ice to give them back. The deeper one digs into these erased chapters, the clearer the pattern becomes. Wars end, yet their echoes remain entombed in steel crates, sunken hulls, and pages stamped classified. The victors may decide what is written, but the truth carves itself into the places no one dares to look. Beneath black water, inside sealed caverns, across the scars of landscapes long forgotten. To walk away from these shadows is to admit they exist, to feel the chill of secrets never meant to breathe air. For every uncovered fragment, 100 more lie in silence, waiting, guarding, reminding us that history is never finished. It is only hidden, patiently, like embers glowing beneath ash, and those embers still burn.